They found the Langford House in Appalachia, and the diary they uncovered shocked the nation. In the autumn of 2003, when the leaves painted the Appalachian mountains in shades of copper and gold, a group of hikers stumbled upon something that would forever change how we understand isolated family structures in America. Hidden deep within the hollows of eastern Kentucky, surrounded by overgrown laurel thickets and forgotten logging roads, stood a weathered two-story structure that had been swallowed by time itself, the Langford House. What these hikers discovered inside would expose one of the most disturbing cases of generational consanguinity ever documented on American soil. The discovery happened on a crisp October morning. 3 college students from Lexington, Sarah Chen, Marcus Webb and Julie Patterson, had ventured off the marked Appalachian Trail, seeking a more adventurous route through the Cumberland Gap region. The fog hung low between the mountains, creating an eerie atmosphere as they pushed through dense vegetation that seemed untouched for decades. Marcus was the first to notice the structure through the mist. At first, he thought it was just another abandoned coal mining building, common relics scattered throughout these mountains. But as they approached, the architecture revealed something different. This was a home once carefully constructed with hand-hewn logs and stone foundations, now sagging under the weight of nearly a century of neglect. The front porch had partially collapsed, and several windows were broken, their frames hanging at odd angles. Vines had claimed the exterior walls, wrapping around the structure like green serpents frozen in time. Sarah, an anthropology major with a keen interest in Appalachian culture, felt an immediate pull toward the building. Something about its isolation, the way it seemed deliberately hidden from the world, sparked her curiosity. Against Marcus's better judgment, they decided to investigate. The wooden steps groaned dangerously under their weight as they climbed onto what remained of the porch. The front door, surprisingly, was unlocked, or rather, the lock had rusted away entirely, leaving the door barely hanging on corroded hinges. Inside, the smell hit them first. Decades of moisture, rotting wood, and something else they couldn't quite identify, something organic and unsettling. The interior was darker than expected, even with several broken windows allowing streams of dusty sunlight to penetrate the gloom. The main room contained remnants of a life long abandoned. A cast-iron stove in one corner, its pipe collapsed onto the floor. A wooden table with 3 chairs, one overturned, and shelves lined with jars, their contents now unrecognizable masses of mold and decay. But what caught Julie's attention was the staircase leading to the 2nd floor. Despite the building's deterioration, the stairs appeared more intact than anything else, almost as if they had been protected somehow. The 3 exchanged glances, and without speaking, they knew they would climb those stairs. Each step creaked ominously, but held their weight. The 2nd floor revealed 3 small bedrooms and what appeared to be a study. It was in this study that Sarah made the discovery that would change everything. On a desk positioned near the room's single window, covered in a thick layer of dust and bird droppings, sat a leather-bound journal. The leather was cracked and faded, but remarkably, the book had survived relatively intact, protected perhaps by the desk's position away from direct water damage. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully lifted the journal. The cover was embossed with initials, EL 1952. She opened it carefully, afraid the brittle pages might disintegrate at her touch. But the pages, though yellowed and fragile, remained legible. The handwriting was elegant, practiced, belonging to someone who had received a proper education. The first entry was dated March 15, 1952. It read, "Today marks the beginning of my testimony. I am Eleanor Langford, born Eleanor Rose Langford on June 3, 1934, and I write these words as a warning to whoever may find them. What I am about to reveal has been the burden of my family for 4 generations, and I fear it will not end with me. My grandfather told me that truth once buried has a way of rising to the surface like bones from disturbed earth. So I commit our truth to these pages, hoping that understanding might come from our tragedy." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she read those opening lines aloud to her companions. The three of them stood in that dusty study, surrounded by the remnants of forgotten lives, and began to piece together a story that would eventually shock not just Kentucky, but the entire nation. Over the next 3 hours, as the afternoon sun shifted across the Appalachian sky, they photographed every page of Eleanor's journal with their digital cameras, documenting a family history that read like a nightmare, wrapped in the mundane details of rural American life. When they finally left the Langford house that evening, they carried with them evidence of something that most people believed only existed in whispered rumors and dark folklore. The journal would later be authenticated by historians at the University of Kentucky, and its contents would spark a federal investigation that uncovered records, birth certificates, and medical documents spanning from 1876 to 1995. The Langford family had lived in complete isolation in those mountains for 4 generations, and the genetic consequences of their choices had created a legacy of suffering that Eleanor had desperately tried to document. But before we continue with what Eleanor wrote, and the shocking discoveries that followed, let me ask you something important. Confira si já é inscrito neste canal, because the stories you'll find here expose the hidden realities that shaped American history, the truths too disturbing to be taught in schools but too important to remain buried. The Langford family story begins in 1876, according to Eleanor's journal and the historical documents later uncovered by investigators. Thomas Langford, a Confederate Army veteran from Virginia, moved into the eastern Kentucky mountains following the Civil War's end. Like many former soldiers, Thomas was damaged by what he had witnessed, what he had done. The post-war South offered him nothing but memories and judgment, so he sought isolation in the Appalachian wilderness, where a man could disappear into the endless folds of mountain hollows and no one would ask questions. Thomas was 32 years old when he built the first cabin on what would become the Langford property, selecting a location so remote that it took a full day's journey by horse from the nearest settlement. With him came his wife, Margaret, aged 28, and their 3 children, William, age 9, Thomas Jr., age 7, and Mary Catherine, age 4. Margaret had been a schoolteacher in Richmond before the war, an educated woman who had married Thomas when he was still a promising young attorney. The war had changed him completely, transforming the man she married into someone she barely recognized. But in those times, a woman's options were limited. She followed her husband into the mountains, bringing with her a small trunk of books, the only connection to her former life she was permitted to keep. The family's first years in the mountains were brutal. Thomas cleared land with his son's help, built their cabin, and established a small farm in a valley so narrow that sunlight only reached it for a few hours each day. Margaret taught the children to read and write using her precious books, determined that isolation would not mean ignorance. But the distance from civilization began to change the family's dynamics in ways that Margaret could never have anticipated. By 1882, their nearest neighbors were still more than 15 miles away, accessible only by treacherous mountain paths that became impassable during winter months. The family became a closed circle, dependent entirely on each other for everything: labor, companionship, education, and eventually something much darker. Eleanor's journal describes what happened next with clinical precision, as if emotional distance might make the facts less horrifying. In 1886, when Mary Catherine turned 14, Thomas Sr. made a decision that would echo through 4 generations of Langfords. He announced to the family that Mary Catherine would not be permitted to leave the mountain to find a husband. Instead, she would marry her brother William, who was then 19 years old. Margaret, according to Eleanor's account, based on family stories passed down, protested violently. She threatened to walk off the mountain herself and report Thomas to authorities. But Thomas had anticipated this. He had spent the previous 6 years reinforcing their isolation, burning bridges both literal and figurative to the outside world. He had guns, and he had made it clear that no one would leave the mountain without his permission. Margaret was trapped, and she knew it. The marriage between William and Mary Catherine took place in the family's cabin, with Thomas Sr. performing a ceremony he created himself, mixing fragments of Bible verses with his own twisted justifications. There was no legal marriage certificate, no official record. Mary Catherine was 14 years old. William, though 19, had never known another life beyond the mountain and had been carefully shaped by his father's increasing paranoia about the outside world. Thomas Sr. had convinced his sons that the world beyond their mountain was corrupt, dangerous, and that keeping the Langford blood pure was a sacred duty. Margaret never recovered from watching her daughter forced into this situation. Eleanor's journal contains a heartbreaking entry, copied from a letter Margaret had written but never sent. "I watch my daughter's eyes grow hollow with each passing day. She is becoming a ghost in her own body. I cannot save her. I cannot save any of us. Thomas has created a hell in this beautiful place, and I am as much a prisoner as my children." Mary Catherine gave birth to her first child in 1887, a son they named Samuel. 2 years later, another son, George. In 1891, a daughter, Rachel. Margaret served as midwife for these births, each one breaking her heart further as she witnessed the beginnings of genetic consequences she had learned about in her education, but never imagined she would see in her own grandchildren. Samuel appeared normal at birth, but as he grew, developmental delays became apparent. By age 5, he struggled with speech and motor coordination. George was born with a cleft palate and would face a lifetime of difficulties eating and speaking. Rachel seemed healthy initially, but by age 2, it became clear she was deaf. Thomas Sr. dismissed these issues as normal variations, or blamed Margaret's midwifing, or claimed God was testing the family's faith. But Margaret knew the truth, and it haunted her until her death in 1897, when she simply gave up her fight to live, dying of what the family described as a broken spirit as much as any physical ailment. With Margaret gone, there was no voice of opposition left in the Langford household. Thomas Jr., the middle son, had married a woman from a settlement 20 miles away in 1889, before Thomas Sr.'s isolation became absolute. Her name was Ellen, and she was 17 when Thomas Jr. brought her to the mountain after their wedding. Ellen was never told about William and Mary Catherine's true relationship. She was told they were cousins who had married, which, while unusual, was not unheard of in Appalachian communities of that era. Ellen gave Thomas Jr. 3 children, a son named James in 1890, a daughter named Violet in 1892, and another son named Henry in 1894. These children, conceived outside the immediate family's consanguinity, showed no genetic issues. This contrast became increasingly obvious as they grew alongside William and Mary Catherine's children. But Thomas Sr.'s plan extended beyond just William and Mary Catherine. When Rachel, deaf and now 15 years old in 1906, reached what Thomas Sr. considered marriageable age, he arranged for her to marry her cousin James, Thomas Jr.'s eldest son, who was 16. Once again, there was no legal marriage, no official record. James had been raised in the isolation of the mountain, home-schooled by Ellen using Margaret's old books, and he had absorbed Thomas Sr.'s teachings about family purity without question. Ellen, when she learned the truth about William and Mary Catherine and realized what was being planned for her son, attempted to flee with her children. She made it 3 miles down the mountain before Thomas Sr. and Thomas Jr. tracked her down. What happened next was never written in detail, but Eleanor's journal contains a single chilling line. Grandmother Ellen was never the same after the day she tried to leave. She stopped speaking entirely and spent her remaining years sitting by the window, staring at the path she had tried to escape down. Rachel and James's union produced 4 children between 1907 and 1914. The genetic consequences were devastating. Their first child, a daughter, lived only 3 days. The second, a son named Robert, was born with severe physical abnormalities that made movement difficult and painful. He would live to age 32, but those years were filled with suffering that Eleanor's journal describes in medical detail that is both precise and heartbreaking. Their third child, a daughter named Dorothy, appeared relatively healthy but struggled with seizures from early childhood. The fourth child, another son named Paul, was born with cognitive disabilities so severe that he never developed speech and required constant care throughout his life. By 1915, 3 generations of Langfords lived on the mountain. Thomas Sr., now 71 and still maintaining iron control over his family. William and Mary Catherine with their surviving children. Thomas Jr. and the silent Ellen with their children. And now James and Rachel with their suffering offspring. The pattern had been set, and it would continue. Thomas Sr. died in 1919. But his legacy lived on in the family structure he had created. William, now 52, assumed control of the family, and he saw no reason to change the system his father had established. The isolation continued, the intermarriage continued, and with each generation, the genetic consequences became more severe. Eleanor's journal moves through this history with a mixture of clinical observation and deep sorrow. She writes, "By the time I was born in 1934, I was the product of 3 generations of consanguinity. My father, Robert, was the son of Rachel and her cousin James. My mother, Violet, was James's sister. They were uncle and niece by blood, married when mother was 16 and father was 27. I should not exist. My existence is a defiance of natural law, and I have paid the price for that defiance every day of my life." Eleanor describes her own health issues with unflinching honesty. Chronic pain from skeletal malformations that became worse as she aged. Vision problems that left her nearly blind in one eye. A heart condition that caused fainting spells and limited her physical capabilities. But perhaps worse than the physical issues was the psychological burden of understanding what she was, what her family had become. Eleanor was different from previous generations because she had access to her great-grandmother Margaret's books, including a medical text that Margaret had kept from her days as a schoolteacher. Eleanor educated herself, and through that education she came to understand the biological reality of her family's situation. She writes, "I am the result of what scientists call inbreeding depression. My family tree does not branch. It collapses in on itself like a dying star." At this point, you might be wondering how such a situation could continue for so long without outside intervention. How could a family live in such complete isolation in 20th century America? The answer lies in the unique geography and culture of Appalachia during this period. Eastern Kentucky's mountain regions were among the most isolated places in the United States. Families living in deep hollows often had minimal contact with outside authorities. There were no regular mail routes, no police patrols, no social workers visiting remote homesteads. The Langford property was situated in a location that required crossing 2 ridges and following a creek bed for several miles before reaching any maintained road. In winter, they were completely cut off from the outside world for months at a time. The family sustained itself through subsistence farming. They grew corn, beans, and potatoes, kept chickens and pigs, hunted deer and wild turkey. They made their own clothes, their own tools, their own everything. Once every few years, one of the men would make the journey to the nearest town to trade furs and ginseng for essentials like salt, sugar, and ammunition. But these trips were rare, brief, and carefully controlled. The townspeople who occasionally encountered a Langford man found them strange and unsettling, but in Appalachia, minding your own business was a virtue, and eccentricity was tolerated as long as it stayed on its own property. No one investigated. No one intervened. The Langfords were left alone with their terrible secrets. Now, at this crucial point in our story, I want you to do something. I need you to understand that what you're hearing is not just history. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when families isolate themselves completely from society, when tradition becomes more important than the well-being of children, when control matters more than care. Drop a comment right now and tell me, isolation destroys innocence. Let me see those comments. Let me know you understand the weight of what we're uncovering together. Say it. Isolation destroys innocence. Eleanor's journal becomes more detailed when describing her own life and the events she witnessed firsthand. She was born in 1934, the eldest of 3 children born to Robert and Violet. Her brother Charles was born in 1936 with severe cognitive disabilities that prevented him from ever functioning independently. Her sister Anna, born in 1938, seemed healthier initially, but developed seizures in early childhood, similar to their grandmother Dorothy. Eleanor describes her childhood as a mixture of beauty and horror. The mountains were breathtaking, she writes, especially in spring when the rhododendrons bloomed and the forest canopy turned a dozen shades of green. She loved the sound of the creek that ran near their house, the way morning mist filled the valleys, the call of whippoorwills at dusk. But this beauty was forever tainted by the reality of her family's situation. By the time Eleanor was 10 years old in 1944, she had educated herself using Margaret's books and had begun to understand what her family really was. She wrote, "I realized we were not blessed, as Grandfather William always claimed. We were cursed, not by God or magic, but by choices, by selfishness, by men who valued control over the welfare of their own children." Eleanor's journal reveals that she tried to run away when she was 15 in 1949. She made it further than her grandmother Ellen had, nearly reaching a paved road before her father Robert and Uncle Paul tracked her down. What happened when they brought her back is described in Eleanor's journal with carefully chosen words that make the horror clear without explicit detail. They made sure I understood that trying to leave was not an option. The punishment was severe enough that I never attempted escape again. I learned that day that there are prisons without bars, and I was in one. By 1950, Eleanor was 16 years old, and the family began discussing her future. She writes, "I knew what they were planning. I had seen it happen to my mother, to my aunt before her, to my grandmother. I was to be married to my cousin Thomas, who was 19 and simple-minded, barely able to care for himself. I would become another link in this chain of genetic disaster, expected to produce the next generation of Langfords regardless of what that would mean for those children. I decided I would rather die than participate in perpetuating this nightmare." Eleanor attempted to harm herself in 1951, but she survived. The attempt left her with permanent scars on her wrists and earned her closer supervision from the family. But it also seemed to awaken something in her father Robert, who, despite his own limitations, retained enough humanity to see his daughter's desperation. Robert did something unprecedented in Langford family history. He refused to force Eleanor to marry Thomas. This caused a massive conflict within the family. William, now 83 years old, but still mentally sharp and authoritarian, was enraged. Several family members argued that Robert was breaking tradition, endangering the family's purity, inviting outside contamination. But Robert stood firm, and he had allies. His brother Henry, Thomas Jr.'s youngest son, who had married outside the family and whose children showed no genetic issues, had begun to question the family's practices. Together, Robert and Henry created a small faction within the Langford clan, that opposed continuing the pattern of consanguinity. This internal conflict divided the family throughout the early 1950s. Eleanor was caught in the middle, grateful for her father's protection, but aware that her situation remained precarious. She threw herself into documenting the family's history, interviewing older relatives while they were still alive, gathering birth and death dates, recording medical conditions, trying to create a complete picture of what 4 generations of intermarriage had produced. Her journal from this period becomes a genealogical nightmare, a family tree that shows cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, siblings producing children together. She estimates that by 1952, every living Langford on the mountain shared so much genetic material that they were effectively as closely related as siblings, regardless of their official family relationships. The health consequences were devastating and varied. Eleanor lists them with meticulous detail. 11 children had died in infancy or early childhood. 7 were born with visible physical abnormalities. 9 struggled with severe cognitive disabilities. 4 were deaf. 6 had significant vision problems. Chronic seizure disorders affected at least 5 individuals. Skeletal issues caused chronic pain in multiple family members. Heart conditions appeared with alarming frequency, and several individuals displayed what Eleanor describes as profound sadness that no medicine or prayer could touch, likely clinical depression arising from both genetic factors and the horror of their circumstances. In 1953, something unexpected happened that would eventually lead to the family's exposure. A social worker named Margaret Hensley, conducting a survey of remote Appalachian families for a government program, managed to reach the Langford property. How she found them remains unclear, but Eleanor's journal describes her arrival as like an angel appearing in hell. Margaret Hensley was a tough, experienced woman in her 40s who had worked in Appalachia for years and thought she had seen everything poverty and isolation could produce. She was not prepared for what she found at the Langford House. The family initially tried to hide the extent of their situation, presenting only the healthiest members. But Margaret was trained to notice signs of trouble, and something about the Langfords immediately alarmed her. She noted several children with obvious, untreated medical conditions, adults who seemed unusually closely related in appearance, and a general atmosphere of secrecy and fear. Margaret attempted to conduct interviews, but most family members refused to speak with her or gave vague, rehearsed answers. Only Eleanor, then 19 years old and desperate for help, attempted to tell the truth. She tried to speak privately with Margaret, but was prevented by her uncle William Jr., who physically interposed himself between the two women. Margaret left the Langford property deeply concerned, but without concrete evidence of wrongdoing beyond poverty and medical neglect, which, while troubling, was not uncommon in isolated Appalachian communities in the 1950s. She filed a report with her agency, recommending follow-up visits and possible intervention, but bureaucracy moved slowly, especially for remote cases. Her report sat in an office in Frankfurt for months before anyone acted on it. By the time a follow-up visit was organized in 1954, the family had been warned and had prepared accordingly. They had cleaned up the property, coached family members on what to say, and hidden the most obviously affected individuals in the back rooms. The investigators, less experienced than Margaret Hensley and dealing with dozens of similar cases, accepted the family's explanations and closed the case. The moment that visit ended, Eleanor writes, "A door slammed shut on any hope I had for rescue." William Sr., the patriarch, who was now 88 years old, summoned the entire family for a meeting. Eleanor's description of this gathering is chilling. Grandfather William stood before us, bent with age, but still commanding, still terrible in his certainty. He said that outsiders had tried to destroy our family, to tear us apart. He said we must be more vigilant than ever, more isolated, more united, and then he said that marriages must resume. that the bloodline must be preserved, that I, despite my father's protection, would be married to cousin Thomas after all. Robert protested again, but he was overruled. William had support from the majority of the family, especially the middle generation who had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into his worldview that they could not imagine any other way of living. Plans were made for Eleanor's forced marriage to Thomas to take place in the spring of 1955. Eleanor had 9 months to find a way out. She used that time to complete her journal, documenting everything she knew about the family's history. She writes, "If I cannot escape, if I'm forced to participate in this evil, then at least I will leave a record. Someone someday will find this journal and will know the truth about the Langfords. They will know that we were not ignorant people who did not understand. They will know that some of us knew exactly what was wrong and were powerless to stop it." The final entries in Eleanor's journal are dated from March 1955. She describes the preparations for her forced marriage with a detached, almost dissociative tone, as if she is describing someone else's life. March 10th, 1955. "They are making me a dress from old curtains. The irony is not lost on me." March 13th, 1955. "Thomas doesn't want this marriage any more than I do. He is scared of me, I think, because I read books and speak in full sentences, but he will do what his father tells him. We are all puppets here." March 15th, 1955. "Tomorrow is the ceremony. Father Robert has been crying. He knows he has failed me. I do not blame him. Some forces are too great for individual resistance." Then there is one final entry dated March 16th, 1955, written in handwriting that becomes increasingly erratic as it progresses. "Today is the day. I am writing this before dawn, while the house still sleeps. I have made my decision. I will not participate in perpetuating this nightmare. I will not bring another generation of suffering into existence. I've hidden this journal where I hope it will be found, but not by family members who would destroy it. To whoever finds this, tell our story. Let the world know what isolation and obsession with bloodline purity can create. Let our tragedy prevent others from following this path. My name is Eleanor Rose Langford. I was born June 3rd, 1934, and I have lived 20 years, 11 months, and 13 days in a beautiful prison. I do not want to die, but I see no other way to maintain my humanity. May God forgive me for what I'm about to do, and may He judge harshly those who drove me to this choice. Remember us. Remember that we were real people, not myths or monsters. Remember that this happened in America in the 20th century, in mountains that looked like paradise but contained hell. The journal ends there. When investigators finally excavated records and interviewed surviving family members decades later, they pieced together what happened after Eleanor wrote those final words. On March 16, 1955, before the forced marriage ceremony was to take place, Eleanor Langford walked into the woods surrounding the family property. She was found 3 days later by her father, Robert, who had been searching desperately. She had consumed a mixture of plants she had identified in Margaret's medical book as being lethal. She was 20 years old. The family buried her on the property in an unmarked grave in a small family cemetery that contained dozens of other Langfords who had died over the previous 80 years. No death certificate was filed. No authorities were notified. Eleanor Langford's death was absorbed into the silence that had always surrounded the family. But Eleanor's story did not end with her death. The journal she hid so carefully remained undiscovered in the Langford house for 48 years, waiting for Sarah, Marcus, and Julie to find it in 2003. When news of the journal's discovery broke in late 2003, it triggered a media sensation and a comprehensive investigation that would finally expose the full scope of the Langford family's isolated existence. Investigators from multiple state and federal agencies descended on eastern Kentucky. What they found was both more and less than expected. The Langford house that the hikers had discovered was not the family's current residence. By 2003, the remaining Langfords had moved to a more accessible location about 8 miles away, living in a modern structure with electricity and running water. The old house had been abandoned in the 1970s when it became structurally unsound, but the family had maintained the surrounding property, using it for hunting and as a burial ground. When investigators arrived at the current Langford residence in November 2003, they found 7 family members living there. Samuel Langford, age 64, grandson of Eleanor's Uncle Henry. His wife Mary Langford, age 61, who was his first cousin. Their 4 adult children, ages 38 to 45, and 1 grandchild, a teenage boy of 15. The intermarriage had continued into a 5th generation, though not to the same extreme degree as in earlier years. Increased contact with the outside world, beginning in the 1970s, when a logging road was extended near their property, had allowed some family members to marry outside the clan. But the tradition of cousin marriage had persisted, normalized by generations of practice. Medical examinations of the living family members revealed ongoing health issues consistent with generations of consanguinity. Higher rates of genetic disorders, autosomal recessive conditions, and various physical and cognitive challenges. The teenage boy showed signs of a rare genetic condition that appeared multiple times in the family history, but was extremely rare in the general population. Samuel Langford gave extensive interviews to investigators, speaking openly about his family's history in a way that would have been impossible in earlier generations. He confirmed much of what Eleanor's journal described, though from his perspective as a descendant of the faction that had questioned the family's practices. His grandfather Henry had married outside the family and had tried to convince others to do the same, with limited success. Samuel himself had married his first cousin Mary, despite his grandfather's objections, he explained, because it's what Langfords do, and she was the only girl I knew well enough to marry. We didn't think it would cause problems because we weren't as close related as some of the others. The investigation revealed that between 1876 and 2003, the Langford family had included approximately 120 individuals across 5 generations. Of these, at least 45 had died in childhood or infancy, an infant mortality rate nearly 20 times higher than the national average. Of those who survived to adulthood, at least 35 displayed significant genetic disorders or disabilities. The family cemetery on the old property contained 53 marked graves and an unknown number of unmarked infant graves. Genetic testing performed on living family members and exhumed remains revealed that the Langfords had one of the highest rates of consanguinity ever documented in an American family, with some individuals showing levels of genetic similarity typically only seen in children of sibling or parent-child relationships. The case raised complex legal and ethical questions. What crimes, if any, had been committed? The forced marriages described in Eleanor's journal would constitute serious crimes under modern law, but they had occurred decades ago, and all the perpetrators were long dead. The family members living in 2003 were victims as much as participants in a multi-generational pattern established long before their births. No charges were ultimately filed against any living Langford family members. Instead, the case became a focus for social workers, geneticists, historians, and ethicists studying isolated populations and the effects of consanguinity. The Langford case study has been used in medical schools, sociology courses, and genetic counseling programs. Eleanor's journal was eventually published with the family's permission, edited to protect the privacy of living relatives. It became a haunting primary source document, a first-hand account of life inside a situation most people could barely imagine. The teenage boy, Eleanor's great-great-nephew, received genetic counseling and medical treatment for his condition. He was encouraged to marry outside the family, to break the pattern that had caused so much suffering, and indeed, he later did so. The extended Langford family, many of whom had moved away from the mountains in previous generations and had not participated in the consanguinity pattern, grappled with the revelation of their family's history. Some changed their names. Others became advocates for genetic counseling and education about the dangers of consanguinity. The old Langford House was eventually stabilized by historical preservation efforts and turned into an educational site, a stark reminder of what can happen when isolation and control trump compassion and common sense. The Appalachian region, often stereotyped and misunderstood, used the Langford case as an opportunity to educate outsiders about the realities of mountain life, both historical and contemporary. Yes, isolation did lead to problems in some families, but the vast majority of Appalachian families never engaged in the practices the Langfords had. The stereotype of inbred mountain families is largely myth, they explained, but the Langford case showed that when it did happen, the consequences were devastating and multi-generational. Eleanor's final wish was granted. The world knew her story. The tragedy was not forgotten, and her testimony, written in secret fear in those final weeks before her death, became a powerful tool for prevention and education. As we close this investigation into the Langford House and the secrets it contained, I want to remind you of something crucial. These were real people. Eleanor was real. Her suffering was real. The generations of children born into a system they did not create and could not escape were real. This is not entertainment or folklore. This is American history, hidden in the mountains, silent until someone brave enough to speak decided that silence was worse than exposure. If you've stayed with this story until the very end, if you've felt the weight of Eleanor's words and understood the tragedy of the Langford family, then I need you to do 3 things for me right now. First, drop a comment below saying, "I watched until the end," so I can see who truly engaged with this story, who understands that these histories matter. Say it now. I watched until the end. Second, hit that like button if this story moved you, if it taught you something, if it made you think about the importance of openness and connection versus isolation and control. And third, share this video with someone who needs to understand how isolation and secrecy can destroy families across generations. The Langford story is extreme, but the lessons it teaches about family dynamics, control, and the importance of connection to broader community are universal. Eleanor wanted her story told. You can help make sure it reaches people who need to hear it.